Welcome to Study Loop.
Here we're really looking at how trade can be beneficial, and we're looking at a very simple example between two roommates rather than taking a look at the mass scale of international trade quite yet. Here we're just trying to get this idea of what is opportunity cost, what are absolute and comparative advantages, and how does all of this impact trade. So let's start with part A here, where we'd like to know what the opportunity cost of making pizza is for both Pat and Kris. So looking at this, for Pat, let's start there. What we see is that it takes him 4 hours to brew 1 gallon of root beer and 2 hours to make a pizza. So what we really want to know is the cost of making a single pizza. How many gallons of root beer is Pat giving up to make that one pizza? So what we see here is that one pizza can be made by Pat in those 2 hours. And in those same 2 hours, what could have been done is a half gallon of root beer. And you can see that because it takes 4 hours for 1 gallon of root beer. So if we're taking half of the 4 hours, which is 2 hours, he would be able to brew half a gallon of root beer. So Pat's opportunity cost of making pizza, of making this one pizza, would be a half gallon of root beer. So that is Pat's opportunity cost of making pizza. Now let's do the same thing for Kris. And we see that Kris takes 6 hours to brew a gallon of root beer and 4 hours to make a pizza. So her one pizza takes her 4 hours. So within those same 4 hours that she spent making that pizza, how many gallons of root beer could she have brewed? Well, it looks like it takes her 6 hours to brew a gallon of root beer. So if we take these 4 hours, we'll divide it by 6, right? Because we want to know, right, this is her 4 hours for a pizza, 6 hours for a gallon of root beer. Dividing them by one another gives us 0.67. And what that tells us is that within those 4 hours of making that one pizza, she could have made 0.67 gallons of root beer. So that would be her opportunity cost here. That's Kris's opportunity cost. Now, if we wanted to compare these absolute and comparative advantages, absolute advantage is looking at just who can make the most in the least amount of time. So we're looking at it for pizza right now, not for root beer. Let's take a look at Pat. He takes 2 hours to make a pizza. Kris takes 4 hours to make a pizza. So what that tells us is that Pat is more efficient at making pizza. So for Pat, he would have the absolute advantage in pizza. Which tells us also, now if we wanted to take a look at this too, if we wanted to look at root beer as well, who takes the least amount of time to make root beer? Well, it looks like Pat also has the absolute advantage in root beer, because it takes him 4 hours versus Kris's 6 hours. But now comparative advantages, which is what we really want to be looking at, is where we start to compare opportunity costs, because we want to know who has to spend the least to make a pizza, if that makes sense. We're looking at whose costs are lower, whose opportunity cost is lower to make a pizza. So we said that Pat's opportunity cost of making a pizza is a half gallon of root beer, versus Kris's opportunity cost of making a pizza is 0.67 gallons of root beer. So we see that Pat's opportunity cost is lower than Kris's. So what we can assume here is that Pat has this comparative advantage in making pizza. And because of that, if we were to take, all we have to do is take the inverses of those opportunity costs, and it would give us the opportunity cost of making root beer. So really what that does is it just switches those comparative advantages. So we can see that Pat has that comparative advantage in pizza, which tells us inherently that Kris must have the comparative advantage in root beer. Her opportunity cost of producing root beer will be lower than Pat's. So now, if we wanted to ask ourselves who will trade which good, people trade and countries trade the good which they have the comparative advantage in. So because we just identified that Pat has that comparative advantage in pizza, we can say that Pat is going to trade pizza. And because we said that Kris has the comparative advantage in root beer, we can also say that Kris will be trading root beer. Now part C here, we want to know the highest and lowest price pizza can be traded at so that both people here, both Kris and Pat, benefit. What we're doing is we're assuming that Pat is only making pizza and Kris is only making root beer. So the lowest cost at which we can produce these in order to trade these so that they're both benefited means that it can't exceed their opportunity cost. So Pat's opportunity cost of producing a pizza is a 1/2 gallon of root beer, which means he's not going to be willing to pay any more than a 1/2 gallon for a pizza. So we're doing this in terms of root beer. So Pat shouldn't be willing to purchase root beer at anything more than a 1/2 gallon per pizza. Because as soon as he's willing to pay more than that, he should have just made it himself. Now, on the other hand, Kris, for purchasing pizza, her opportunity cost of pizza is 0.67 gallons of root beer. So she should not be willing to trade more than that in order to get her pizza. So here we could say that her one pizza should be traded at this 0.67 gallons per one pizza.